When Elijah Moore, a determined black advocate, arrives in a small town to help families being unfairly stripped of their land, he quickly becomes a target of systemic racism and corruption. A power-hungry officer, Daniels, and a crooked judge, Reed, use intimidation, planted evidence, and public humiliation to silence Elijah, portraying him as a troublemaker. As tensions rise, Daniels's open hostility and racial prejudice escalate into infuriating confrontations, revealing the deep rot within the system. With everything stacked against him, Elijah refuses to back down, determined to expose the truth and fight for justice. The storm rolled in slowly, dark clouds gathering over the quiet streets of Northfield. Inside the precinct, the low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed like a persistent whisper, filling the heavy silence of a long, uneventful evening. Officers sat at their desks, their voices muted as they buried themselves in paperwork or idle conversation. It was the kind of night where nothing should have gone wrong. But then, she walked in. Maya Turner was not the kind of person you expected to see inside the precinct, especially at this hour. Dressed in a tailored black coat and ankle boots, she carried herself with a deliberate calm that didn't match the nervous energy most people brought into the building. Her hair was pulled into a sleek bun, sharp features framed by small gold earrings that glinted under the sterile lights. She looked out of place, and she knew it. Officer Brent Wilkes looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing as Maya approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Wilkes was a man who prided himself on reading people, and everything about Maya's calm confidence put him on edge. "I need to speak with the captain," Maya replied, her tone steady. She didn't blink, didn't fidget. Just stood there, waiting. Wilkes leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes flick over her, searching for something he couldn't quite find. "The captain's busy," he said finally. "If you've got a complaint, take it up with the desk sergeant." Maya didn't move. "Tell him it's Maya Turner," she said. "He'll make time." There was something in the way she said it, soft, unyielding, that made Wilkes hesitate. He exchanged a glance with his partner, whose shrug offered no help. Without another word, Wilkes stood and disappeared into the captain's office, leaving Maya alone in the middle of the bullpen. Around her, officers glanced up from their desks, some trying not to stare, while others openly assessed her. The air in the room shifted, as if an invisible string had been pulled tight. Maya stood still, unfazed by the curious gazes. She wasn't here to explain herself to anyone. Not yet. Inside the captain's office, Brent Wilkes leaned over the desk. "There's a woman out there," he said, lowering his voice as if to contain the conversation. "Says her name's Maya Turner, claims you'll want to see her." Captain Alan Foster, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair and a permanent scowl, barely looked up. "And why the hell would I care who she is?" Wilkes hesitated. "She didn't say, but I think you might want to find out." Foster's eyes flicked to the window that overlooked the bullpen. Through the glass, he could see Maya Turner standing in the center of the room, perfectly still, her gaze steady as she met his from across the space. Something in that look made his stomach tighten. "Send her in," he muttered. When Maya entered the office, Foster gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Have a seat," he said gruffly, trying to sound dismissive, but Maya didn't sit. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a thin manila folder onto his desk. "What's this?" Foster asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Proof," Maya replied, her voice calm and direct. Foster flipped open the folder, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the first page. He paused, his jaw tightening. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Maya met his glare without flinching. "What matters is that you know it's true." Foster slammed the folder shut, his face pale. "Do you have any idea what you're accusing my department of?" "I'm not accusing," Maya corrected, her tone like ice. "I'm showing you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Outside, the officers went about their business, unaware of the storm that was about to hit their precinct, one that would tear apart everything they thought they knew about loyalty, justice, and the thin blue line. Because Maya Turner hadn't come here for a conversation, she'd come to expose them. The hum of the old diner, blended with the steady clink of cutlery against ceramic plates. The worn linoleum floor, long past its prime, creaked softly beneath the feet of the waitress, moving briskly between tables. Overhead, the neon Route 17 diner sign buzzed faintly, its flickering letters casting a muted glow on the faded red booths below. Outside, the soft drizzle of rain darkened the pavement and slicked the windshields of parked cars. The place wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. Seated at a corner booth, away from the idle chatter and the jukebox coughing out soft country tunes, Elijah Moore cradled a steaming cup of black coffee. He wore a navy wool coat draped over a simple dark turtleneck, an outfit that managed to look understated, despite its clear quality. His posture was relaxed but composed, a quiet confidence radiating from him. Even in the simplest of moments, Elijah didn't need to announce his presence. People who truly commanded respect rarely did. The man across the table, a wiry figure in a worn leather jacket, cleared his throat. His name was Jimmy Collins, local, anxious, and clearly unprepared for the conversation they were having. He kept fidgeting with the rim of his coffee cup, his eyes darting to the window, as if looking for an escape route. "Elijah, look," Jimmy stammered, his voice low, the words tumbling out. "I appreciate you coming down here, I really do. But you don't need to get involved. This ain't exactly your fight." Elijah lifted his gaze slowly, his dark brown eyes piercing yet calm, holding Jimmy in place without raising his voice. "It is, though," he replied, his tone even and measured. "When people are hurting, when they're being overlooked or stepped on, it's always my fight, whether you like it or not." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably. "This town—" He hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner, as if the walls might hear him. "This town doesn't like people stirring up trouble. You're not gonna change things, Elijah. Not here." A flicker of something unreadable passed across Elijah's face, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "I've spent most of my life hearing that exact sentiment, Jimmy. And yet here I am." He set his coffee down with a soft clink. "Change doesn't happen because it's convenient. It happens because someone's willing to face the inconvenience." Jimmy opened his mouth as if to argue, but the words failed him. Instead, he slumped back against the booth, letting out a defeated sigh. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Elijah gave a small, understanding nod. He wasn't naive. This wasn't the first time he'd stepped into a place where his presence was seen as disruptive. But he had learned long ago that progress rarely came without making people uncomfortable. The diner wasn't the kind of place where someone like Elijah Moore was expected to sit unnoticed. He wasn't loud, and he wasn't flashy, but his presence had weight, the kind of weight that made people pause just a beat too long when they saw him. He wasn't sure if it was his broad shoulders, his deliberate movements, or the quiet certainty in the way he spoke. Maybe it was because, in a town like this, men who looked like him were more often seen as suspects than as saviors. "More coffee?" Elijah turned to find the waitress hovering near his table. Her smile was polite but cautious, like she wasn't quite sure what to make of him. Her name tag read, Lori, and the tired lines around her eyes suggested she'd been on shift longer than anyone had a right to be. "Please," Elijah said with a warm, easy smile. He slid his cup toward her, and her shoulders seemed to relax just a little. "Passing through?" she asked as she filled his cup. "Something like that." Lori gave a small nod, wiping her hands on her apron as she glanced at Jimmy, who was still slouched across the table, nursing his own cup like it might offer him salvation. "Friend of yours?" she asked quietly. Elijah didn't miss the note of curiosity in her voice. People around here weren't used to seeing men like him sitting with men like Jimmy. "An old friend," he replied simply, letting the words carry more weight than the surface meaning. Lori lingered for a moment longer, like she wanted to say something else, but then thought better of it. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, before heading back behind the counter. As Elijah watched her leave, he noticed the man at the table across the room staring at him. He was middle-aged, balding, and wearing a rumpled flannel shirt. He wasn't subtle about it either. His gaze was sharp, lingering, as if Elijah's very existence in the diner was a puzzle he didn't want to solve. When their eyes met, the man quickly looked away, scowling into his plate. Elijah sighed silently and turned back to Jimmy. "What you're dealing with?" It's bigger than you realize, he said. But you're not alone in this. Jimmy scoffed. Feels like I am. You're not. The words hung between them, firm and resolute. Elijah wasn't a man who gave promises lightly. Outside the diner, the rain had picked up, turning into a steady downpour that drummed against the rooftop and slicked the pavement. Elijah stepped outside, his coat pulled close against the chill. The air smelled of damp asphalt and the faint, acrid tang of smoke drifting from a nearby chimney. He liked moments like this. Quiet moments, when the world slowed down enough to remind him why he did what he did. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for Elijah's black Range Rover, which stood out like a sore thumb among the older trucks and rusted sedans. It wasn't ostentatious, just practical, something he needed for the life he lived, driving between cities, small towns, and backroom meetings like the one he'd just had. He'd never been one for extravagance, despite what people assumed. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed on the console. The name on the screen made his brow furrow. Dr. Moore, he answered smoothly. Elijah. The voice on the other end was sharp, and no nonsense. Anita Jones, his senior associate at the foundation. You've stirred something up again, haven't you? Elijah smiled faintly. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the act, Anita replied. I got a call this morning. Someone from that little town you're in said you were sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Sound familiar? Elijah's grip on the wheel tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. Small towns didn't need sirens or flashing lights to send warnings. They just needed phone calls to people in high places. Some people don't appreciate a little help, he said evenly. Well, they're not subtle about it, Anita muttered. Be careful, Elijah. Not everyone plays by your rules. I know, Elijah said, his tone softer now. But that doesn't mean I'll stop. Stubborn as ever, Anita replied with a resigned sigh. Just keep me updated, will you? I'd like to know you're alive. Elijah chuckled lightly. Will do. As he ended the call, Elijah glanced in the rearview mirror. Across the street, a lone figure stood under a flickering street lamp, watching him. It was the same man from the diner. The one who had stared at him so intently. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He simply met the man's gaze, letting the silent message pass between them. I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. The figure shifted uneasily, as if the weight of Elijah's attention was too much to bear, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Elijah exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he could feel it. The storm was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. The next morning, the rain had subsided, leaving a thin mist clinging to the streets of Milltown. The town, tucked between rolling hills and distant stretches of farmland, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Its small brick courthouse stood like a monument in the center of the square, framed by a flagpole and a few scattered benches. Elijah parked his Range Rover near the curb, stepping out with a leather folder tucked under one arm. He paused to take in the scene, the damp air carrying the faint smell of exhaust and coffee from the cafe across the street. Small towns had a rhythm, quiet, slow-moving on the surface, but full of tension that lingered just out of sight. He adjusted the collar of his coat and crossed the street, his footsteps purposeful, but unhurried. He had been summoned here, through a vague but official-sounding request, to meet with Judge Malcolm Reed about a case involving land disputes in the county. Elijah had seen this play out before. Wealthy developers, overlooked communities, and a justice system that often leaned wherever the money flowed. Inside the courthouse, the halls were narrow and lined with faded portraits of stern-looking judges, their eyes fixed on the generations who passed beneath them. A receptionist's desk sat to the side of the entrance, cluttered with file folders and an ancient computer monitor. The woman behind the desk, a white woman in her late 50s, glanced up as Elijah approached. Her lips pursed slightly, her expression instantly wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clipped. Elijah offered a polite smile. "I'm Elijah Moore. I have a 10 a.m. meeting with Judge Reed." Her eyes flicked down to the calendar on her desk, and then back up to him, suspicion lingering on her face. "You're here for Judge Reed?" "That's right." Elijah remained calm, unbothered by the extra emphasis in her tone. Her hesitation lasted just a beat too long. You sure you're in the right place? There it was, a subtle barb, harmless enough to sound unintentional, but Elijah had seen it, and heard it, countless times before. The kind of question that assumed his presence in such a setting had to be a mistake. He inhaled slowly through his nose, steadying himself. I'm certain, Elijah replied smoothly. Would you mind letting him know I'm here? She frowned as if debating whether to send him away, but finally picked up the phone, muttering into the receiver. Elijah could hear her whispered tone. Someone's here to see you. I don't know. He says his name is Elijah Moore. Elijah turned slightly, scanning the hall behind him. A few people waiting on benches eyed him with mild curiosity. 2 uniformed deputies stood near the entrance to the courtroom, their conversation pausing briefly as one of them, tall, broad with a buzz cut, glanced Elijah's way. The look wasn't friendly. The receptionist hung up, plastering a thin smile on her face. Judge Reed will see you now, she said, gesturing to the tall wooden doors at the end of the hall. Thank you. Elijah strode down the hallway, ignoring the weight of their stares on his back. The doors to Judge Reed's chambers creaked slightly as he pushed them open. Inside, the office was just as he expected. Large, imposing, with towering bookshelves and heavy leather chairs. Behind an oversized mahogany desk sat Judge Malcolm Reed, a man in his early 60s, with a face weathered by years of stern rulings and cigar smoke. His white hair was combed back neatly, his dark suit perfectly tailored. Reed looked up as Elijah entered, his expression immediately shifting to one of poorly masked surprise. He stood, buttoning his jacket. Mr. Moore? He said, as though testing the name on his tongue. That's right. Elijah extended his hand. Reed looked at it for a half-second too long before shaking it. His grip was firm, but the hesitation spoke volumes. You're here about the land dispute? Reed asked, his brow furrowed. I am, Elijah confirmed, placing his leather folder neatly on the judge's desk before taking the chair across from him. I received your request for a meeting and thought it best to come in person. Reed sat down, his hands clasped on the desk in front of him. He cleared his throat. I didn't expect... He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. I didn't expect you to handle this yourself, Mr. Moore. Elijah's smile was polite, unwavering. I find that when something matters, it's best not to send someone else in your place. Reed regarded him for a moment, and Elijah could see the wheels turning. He knew exactly what Reed saw when he looked at him. A black man, sharply dressed but far too young, far too composed, for the position Reed likely imagined Elijah to hold. Well, Reed said finally, sitting back in his chair, I'll be frank with you. I'm not sure what your foundation hopes to accomplish here. The residents in question have no real claim to that land. It's just paperwork. Elijah opened his folder, sliding a series of documents across the desk. That paperwork happens to include deeds, records, and affidavits dating back 3 generations. The land belongs to those families. Judge Reed developers are trying to take it from them, and we both know why. Reed's expression hardened. Mr. Moore, I'm not sure what you're insinuating. I'm not insinuating anything, Elijah cut in, his voice calm but firm. I'm stating facts. Families who've lived on that land for generations, who happen to look like me, are being forced out to make way for a luxury development project that will strip them of everything they've built. Reed's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. These things are complicated, he said tersely. No, Elijah replied evenly, holding his gaze. They're not. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. For a moment, Elijah thought he saw a flicker of discomfort in Reed's eyes, like the man was staring at something he couldn't quite look away from. You're a persistent man, Mr. Moore, Reed said finally. I've been called worse, Elijah replied with a faint, humorless smile. The judge stood, clearly ready to end the conversation. I'll review the materials, he said curtly, but I make no promises. I'll look forward to hearing your decision, Elijah said as he rose from his chair, and I trust you'll remember that justice doesn't have to be complicated. Reed's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. As Elijah exited the judge's chambers and stepped back into the hallway, the tension he'd been holding in his shoulders began to ease. Just slightly. He walked briskly toward the exit, his expression calm, but inside, the anger simmered beneath the surface. Near the front doors, the two deputies stood waiting. One of them, Buzzcut, stepped forward, blocking Elijah's path. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice a little too sharp. Elijah stopped, arching a brow. "Yes? You mind telling me what you're doing here?" the deputy asked. Elijah's grip on his folder tightened, but he kept his voice measured. "I had a meeting." "With Judge Reed?" Buzzcut snorted. "Sure you did." The second deputy glanced between them, his face blank, but he said nothing. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Elijah said, his voice calm but resolute. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Buzzcut stepped aside, but his glare lingered as Elijah passed. "Watch yourself," the deputy muttered, low enough that it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. Elijah didn't look back. Outside, the mist had lifted, replaced by a gray, overcast sky. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears as he reached his car and opened the door. He paused, resting his hands on the roof of the SUV, exhaling slowly. These moments never got easier. The indignity of it all. The constant, unspoken challenge to prove who he was, where he belonged, and why he had a right to be there. And yet, no matter how many times it happened, Elijah refused to let it break him. Because this wasn't about him. It was about the families who had trusted him to fight for them. It was about people like Buzzcut, people who thought they could keep him in his place, realizing that Elijah Moore wasn't going anywhere. As he climbed into his car, Elijah's phone buzzed on the console. It was a message from Anita. "Any trouble?" Elijah smiled faintly, his fingers hovering over the screen before typing back, "Nothing I can't handle." And then he drove off, the courthouse shrinking in his rearview mirror as the storm that had been brewing finally began to crack open. The first sign of trouble came late that afternoon. Elijah was halfway through reviewing an updated file from his team when his phone buzzed, breaking his focus. He glanced at the screen. Anita again. "Call me now." Elijah's brow furrowed as he grabbed his phone and stepped outside, leaving the quiet hum of the small rented office behind. The cool air hit his face as he dialed Anita's number. She picked up immediately. "You've got a problem, Elijah." "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but tight. "Someone leaked a story to the local press," Anita replied, her words clipped with urgency. "They're saying you're meddling in legitimate county business, implying you're strong-arming the judge and interfering with development deals." Elijah exhaled sharply. "Who's behind it?" "I don't know yet, but it has Daniel's fingerprints all over it." Elijah didn't need to ask which Daniels. Officer Raymond Daniels had been with the county sheriff's department for over a decade, one of Judge Reed's unofficial enforcers. He wasn't loud about his biases, he didn't need to be. The quiet, smirking contempt in his actions said enough. Anita continued, "The news outlet's spinning it like you're an outsider stirring up trouble for your own gain, and it's working. Comments are already flooding in. People are mad, Elijah. They're painting you as a threat to the town." Elijah leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to his forehead as the weight of it settled in. He knew how quickly false narratives could spread, especially in towns like this, where fear of change was a language everyone understood. "Let them say what they want," Elijah muttered, though his voice held an edge. "The truth will come out." "You'd better hope it does, and fast," Anita shot back. "But you know how this works. Perception is reality. I've seen situations like this turn dangerous." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I'm not leaving, Anita. Not until this is settled." "Then watch your back," she said. "You're playing with fire." The arrest. Elijah didn't have to wait long for the flames to reach him. That evening, as he walked back to his SUV parked outside the courthouse, he noticed them. 2 squad cars, headlights flaring like watchful eyes in the dim evening light. 3 officers leaned against their vehicles, the shine of their badges catching the last traces of the sun. Daniel stood among them, arms crossed, his face a mask of smug authority. Elijah's steps slowed, his instincts kicking in. He'd seen this setup before. It was a trap. "Mr. Moore," Daniels called out, pushing off from the car and taking a step forward. "Hold it right there." Elijah stopped, his pulse steady, but his shoulders taut. "Can I help you, Officer Daniels?" Daniels smiled, a slow, taunting grin. That depends. You planning on leaving town anytime soon? I don't see how that's any of your business, Elijah replied calmly, keeping his voice measured. Well, it is my business when we've received a complaint about someone tampering with official records. The accusation hung in the air like a foul stench. Elijah frowned, his mind already piecing together their game. I have no idea what you're talking about. Daniels stepped closer, the two other officers falling into place beside him. The air crackled with an unspoken threat. Then maybe you can explain why Judge Reed reported documents missing from his office shortly after your little visit this morning? Elijah's heart slammed against his ribs, but he didn't flinch. You're reaching, Daniels. You think so? Daniels smirked, pulling a small plastic baggie from his pocket. Inside was a stack of neatly folded documents, copies of the very files Elijah had left with the judge. This look familiar? Daniels asked, holding the bag just high enough to taunt him. Elijah froze, his mind racing. He'd left the originals in Reed's office hours ago. These were planted. This is ridiculous, Elijah said, his voice sharp but controlled. Those aren't mine, and you know it. Maybe, Daniels said with a shrug. But until we sort it out, I think you better come with us. I'm not under arrest, Elijah countered. Daniels's smirk widened. Not yet. But you're obstructing an investigation, and we don't take kindly to that here. Cuff him. The two officers moved forward, their faces blank, but their intent clear. Elijah held up his hands, refusing to let them see how much this infuriated him. He'd spent years perfecting this, keeping his composure, while others worked to strip him of his dignity. This is a mistake, Elijah said evenly, as they spun him around and clicked the cuffs tight around his wrists. And when the truth comes out, you'll answer for it. Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss. Truth doesn't matter much around here, Moore. You've overstayed your welcome. They shoved him toward the squad car, the metal cuffs biting into his skin. Elijah lifted his chin, his eyes catching the stares of onlookers gathering nearby, townspeople, curious but unsympathetic. A few muttered to one another, some looked away. He recognized the look on their faces. Silent approval. The shame wasn't his, but still, it stung. The jailhouse. The holding cell was small and cold, the single metal bench bolted to the concrete wall offering little comfort. Elijah sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his mind spinning as he replayed the events in his head. The humiliation of it gnawed at him, not because of what Daniels and his cronies thought they'd done, but because he knew how others would see it. How many times had this happened before, to people who didn't have the resources, the connections, or the resolve to fight back? How many had been silenced by systems designed to tear them down? He closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. Daniels thought this would be enough to scare him off, to humiliate him into silence. They couldn't have been more wrong. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Elijah looked up to see Mitchell, one of the younger deputies, approaching with a set of keys jangling in his hand. Mitchell stopped in front of the cell, avoiding Elijah's gaze at first. You've been released, he muttered, unlocking the door. Elijah stood, studying the young officer's face. There was hesitation there, maybe even guilt. And what about the charges? Mitchell sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. They're dropping them. They don't have anything on you, but... He hesitated. They wanted to send a message. Elijah stepped out of the cell, his calm expression never wavering. Well, you can tell them I got it loud and clear. Mitchell glanced up at him then, his voice softer. Look, not everyone agrees with Daniels. There are good people here, but you're stepping on toes, Mr. Moore. Elijah regarded him for a long moment. Good people don't stay silent, Mitchell. Not when they know what's happening is wrong. The young deputy swallowed hard, as if the words hit him somewhere deep. Be careful, he said finally. Elijah nodded once. You too. The storm brews. Outside the station, the evening had turned dark, the first streaks of lightning breaking across the horizon. Elijah stepped into the lot, his SUV waiting for him under a flickering street lamp. Across the way, a figure leaned casually against a pickup truck. Daniels. Hope you enjoyed your stay, Daniels called, his voice dripping with mockery. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away. But his mind was already working. Daniels and Reed thought they could bury him with this stunt, but they'd underestimated the storm they'd unleashed. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing the rot they were so desperate to protect. As he pulled onto the highway, his phone buzzed again. A text from Anita. "Are you okay?" "What now?" Elijah's gaze hardened as he tightened his grip on the wheel. He typed a simple response before speeding into the dark, the storm rumbling in the distance. "We fight back." Elijah sat at the edge of the motel bed, the room dimly lit by a lone lamp casting shadows against peeling wallpaper. His jacket hung over the chair, his leather folder spread open on the desk beside his laptop. Pages of deeds, affidavits, and legal research were carefully laid out. The evidence of truth he knew could unravel everything. Daniels, Judge Reed, and their allies were trying to protect. The day's events replayed in his mind: the taunts, the humiliation, the tight grip of cold steel cuffs biting into his wrists. Daniel's smug face lingered longest, his quiet venom more dangerous than a shouted threat. Elijah closed his eyes and exhaled, pushing the anger down deep where it wouldn't cloud his focus. A knock at the door broke the silence. Elijah's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He crossed the room in 2 strides and paused. "Who is it?" "It's Mitchell." Elijah frowned slightly before unlocking the deadbolt and opening the door just wide enough to see the young deputy standing outside, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. Mitchell looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder into the darkened parking lot. "Can I come in?" Elijah stepped aside, gesturing him in. "You're either brave or reckless for showing up here," Elijah said, shutting the door firmly behind them. Mitchell shook his head, his shoulders stiff with tension. "I shouldn't even be here, but I can't let this go." Elijah watched him closely. Mitchell's face was pale, sweat gathering at his temples despite the cool air outside. He looked like a man balancing on the edge of a decision too big for him. "What do you know?" Elijah asked, his voice steady. Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor before meeting Elijah's. "Daniels and Judge Reed. They're deeper into this than you think, the development deal. It's not just about money, there's a network." "Be specific." Elijah's words were firm, but calm. Mitchell swallowed hard. "Developers paid Reed to ignore land claims. Daniels keeps the locals in line, making sure no one fights back, but it doesn't stop there. Some of the money's been traced to county accounts, public funds being rerouted to development projects that don't exist. Anyone who tries to blow the whistle gets buried." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. It was worse than he'd imagined, though he wasn't surprised. Small towns often hid big secrets, and those secrets rotted systems from the inside out. Mitchell sat heavily in the chair, rubbing a hand down his face. "They set you up today to discredit you. Daniels said you'd back off once they made it clear you weren't welcome." Elijah allowed himself a bitter smile. "That's their mistake, I don't back off." "You don't understand," Mitchell said quickly, his voice dropping. "They're not done yet. They're saying you resisted arrest. Daniels is working on spinning it into something bigger, something that could stick. They're trying to turn the town against you." Elijah's gaze hardened. "Let them. Truth isn't on their side." Mitchell stood abruptly, his hands trembling as he shoved them back into his pockets. "Look, I'm telling you this because I think what they're doing is wrong. But you don't get it, Mr. Moore. You're not from here, you can't beat them." Elijah stepped forward, his tone low but commanding. "What do you think happens if I leave, Mitchell? What happens to those families? What happens to you when Daniels comes looking for someone else to intimidate?" Mitchell froze, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. "That's what they count on," Elijah continued, his voice steady but sharp. "Silence, fear. That's how men like Daniels win." The younger man's shoulders sagged as the weight of Elijah's words settled on him. "What are you gonna do?" Elijah glanced toward the desk, at the files and laptop glowing faintly in the lamplight. "I'm going to expose them." Mitchell let out a shaky breath, nodding once before turning toward the door. "I'll try to help where I can," he said quietly. "But if anyone finds out I came here—" "They won't," Elijah promised. "Thank you, Mitchell, I mean it." Mitchell left, and Elijah locked the door behind him. Alone again, Elijah returned to the desk, his mind already running through a plan. Daniels and Reed had built a system on fear, manipulation, and corruption. If he wanted to beat them, Elijah would have to shine a light on everything they were trying to hide. But first, he needed help. The press conference. The next morning, Elijah stood on the steps of the courthouse, the files from his folder now neatly stacked under one arm. A small crowd had gathered. Local reporters, townspeople curious enough to come see what the outsider was up to. The air was cool, but the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days, casting sharp light on everything. Elijah scanned the crowd. Judge Reed wasn't there, but he spotted Daniels lingering near the back, flanked by two other officers. Daniels' arms were crossed over his chest, his face a mask of smug disdain. Good, Elijah thought. Let him watch. A local reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. Mr. Moore, can you explain why you called this conference? There's been a lot of concern about your involvement in county matters. Elijah smiled faintly, holding her gaze. I'm here because the truth matters, whether it's convenient or not. He stepped forward and raised his voice, speaking so everyone could hear. This isn't about me. It's about families who have lived on this land for generations, families who are being cheated out of their homes through corruption, intimidation, and lies. A ripple moved through the crowd. Daniels shifted where he stood, his expression darkening. I have the proof, Elijah continued, holding up a set of documents, land deeds, property records, and evidence of public funds being siphoned off for private gain. This isn't just negligence, it's corruption, and it goes deeper than most of you realize. Who are you accusing? Another reporter called out. Elijah didn't hesitate. Judge Reed, Officer Daniels, and anyone else complicit in this scheme. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Daniels pushed forward, his voice cutting through the noise. This is a joke, he barked, his face red with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about, Moore. Elijah turned to face him directly, his expression calm but resolute. The truth makes people uncomfortable, Daniels, but it doesn't change the facts. You're lying, Daniels snapped, stepping closer. You don't belong here, stirring up trouble. And you don't belong in a position of power, Elijah shot back, his voice clear and sharp. But that's not my call to make, it's the people's. Daniels's hands curled into fists at his sides, his rage barely contained. Elijah knew he was towing a dangerous line, but this was what men like Daniels feared most: exposure. The crowd watched intently now, their earlier skepticism giving way to something else: uncertainty, doubt. Tomorrow morning, Elijah continued, turning back to the reporters, I'll be releasing everything I've found to the press and the State Attorney General's office. I suggest those involved prepare their defenses. Daniels lunged forward, his voice a growl. This isn't over, Moore. Elijah met his glare without flinching. It's only just begun. As Elijah stepped down from the courthouse steps, the tension hung thick in the air. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their whispered conversations trailing after them. But Elijah's focus remained on Daniels, who stood glaring at him, his face a mixture of fury and something else: fear. Elijah climbed into his SUV, his hands steady on the wheel as he drove away. He had just thrown a match onto the powder keg Reed and Daniels had spent years building. Now, all he had to do was wait for the explosion. The storm had finally arrived. Dark clouds churned above Milltown, the sharp cracks of thunder echoing across the quiet streets. Sheets of rain pounded the pavement, washing the town in a curtain of gray. Elijah's SUV pulled into the muddy courthouse lot, tires skidding slightly before coming to a halt. The headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating the entrance to the building where two figures waited, Daniels and Judge Reed. Elijah turned off the engine and exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tightly for just a moment. He knew this was it, the tipping point. He grabbed his leather folder from the passenger seat, feeling its familiar weight, then pushed open the door and stepped into the storm. Daniels was already smiling as Elijah approached, his arms crossed over his chest like a man who believed he'd already won. Judge Reed stood slightly behind him, his face pulled into a tight scowl as water slicked off his hat and shoulders. Came to see yourself out of town, Moore? Daniels called, his voice carrying over the rain, smug and taunting. Elijah stopped a few feet from them, rain dripping from his coat. No, Daniels, he replied evenly, his voice cutting through the downpour. I came to finish this. Daniel's grin faltered ever so slightly. You don't get it, do you? He sneered. You've got no friends here, no support. The people don't want you. You're just a loudmouth outsider who doesn't know when to quit. Elijah tilted his head slightly, rain running down his face, but his voice was calm and unshakable. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night, that the people here are with you, that they're too blind to see what you and Reed are doing? Watch yourself, Daniels snapped, stepping forward. You're lucky you're not rotting in a cell right now. Elijah didn't flinch. You had your chance, Daniels. You thought planting evidence and throwing me behind bars would scare me off, but you forgot one thing. He held up the leather folder, water running in rivulets down its surface. I'm not scared of you. Judge Reed finally spoke, his voice gravelly and controlled. Mr. Moore, this is pointless. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. I'd suggest you take whatever's left of your reputation and leave. Elijah's lips curved into the faintest smile. Oh, I have plenty of proof. He stepped closer, his voice rising slightly, cutting through the wind and rain. I have the records of public funds being funneled into fake development projects. I have property deeds that you tried to erase, Judge Reed. Evidence that shows families here were swindled out of land that's rightfully theirs. Reed's face paled slightly, but Daniels laughed, a cold, humorless sound. You think anyone's going to believe that you can wave those papers around all day, but this town trusts us, not you. Elijah stared at Daniels, his eyes unwavering. That might have been true before. But it's not true anymore. From behind him, footsteps crunched on gravel. Elijah turned slightly, as a group of people emerged from the courthouse entrance. Reporters holding cameras, microphones wrapped in plastic to shield them from the rain. Among them were members of the local community, families Elijah had spoken to, young and old alike. Some held umbrellas, others didn't bother, their faces determined as they stepped forward. At the head of the group was Mitchell, his deputy's badge still pinned to his chest. Daniel's expression darkened, his confidence slipping as the crowd gathered. What the hell is this? He barked. It's accountability, Elijah replied simply. I invited the press and the people you've been stomping on for years. They're here to see you answer for it. Judge Reed's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is a setup you have no authority to. Elijah cut him off, raising his voice so everyone could hear. Judge Reed, this folder contains signed affidavits from multiple families detailing exactly how they were harassed and intimidated into giving up their land. It contains financial records showing public funds diverted into private pockets, and Daniels. Elijah turned to face him now, his voice like iron. There are witness accounts of your involvement in planting evidence and obstructing justice. Daniel's face contorted with rage. You think you can walk in here and ruin me? He shouted, lunging forward. Elijah didn't back up. He planted his feet, holding Daniel's furious glare. You ruined yourself the moment you decided you were above the law. For a moment, Daniels faltered, his fists clenching at his sides, his chest heaving, as if barely restraining himself. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the patter of rain and the low hum of murmurs from the crowd. Mitchell stepped forward then, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. Sergeant Daniels, you're under investigation. The State Attorney General's office received Elijah Moore's evidence this morning, and after seeing what's in it, they're sending investigators here. He nodded toward the reporters. This isn't going away. Daniels whipped around, his expression incredulous. You're siding with him. Mitchell met Daniels' glare with surprising steadiness. I'm doing what's right. Something you should have done a long time ago. The crowd rippled with agreement, several people shouting their support. The sound seemed to rattle Daniels, whose bravado was now visibly crumbling. Judge Reed stepped back, as if trying to physically distance himself from the situation unraveling before him. You'll regret this, Daniels growled, jabbing a finger at Elijah. All of you will? No, Elijah replied quietly, his voice measured but strong. You're the one who's going to regret it, because for the first time in your life, you're going to answer for what you've done. Daniel's fury exploded then. You son of a... He lunged at Elijah, fists swinging. But Elijah was ready. He shifted to the side, letting Daniel's momentum carry him forward. The sergeant stumbled, losing his balance, and before he could recover, Mitchell and two other deputies grabbed him, wrestling him into cuffs. Daniels shouted and thrashed, his face twisted with fury, but it was over. The crowd erupted as the cameras captured every moment. For years, Daniels had operated with impunity, but now, under the glow of flashbulbs and the watchful eyes of the community, his downfall was complete. Judge Reed, meanwhile, looked stunned, his power visibly slipping away with every passing second. "This isn't over," he shouted to no one in particular, backing toward the courthouse door. "You're making a mistake." "No," Elijah said firmly, stepping forward so Reed could hear him clearly. "We're fixing one." Reed's eyes darted from Elijah to the crowd, realizing there was no escape. The reporters turned their attention to him, cameras and microphones closing in like vultures. He pushed through the doors, disappearing inside the courthouse. But Elijah knew his time was up. Elijah stood for a moment, the rain running down his face, as the crowd swelled with energy. Questions, cheers, and conversations blending into a powerful hum. Mitchell approached, his expression uncertain but respectful. "You did it," he said quietly. Elijah shook his head. "No. We did it, you, those families, and everyone else who decided to stand up." He glanced at the deputies leading Daniels toward a waiting squad car. "This is just the start." Mitchell nodded, his face thoughtful. "What now?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Now, we rebuild." As Elijah stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, he looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the families who had fought so hard to be heard. The storm had broken, but its aftermath was just beginning. He knew the work wasn't over. Daniels would face trial. Reed's empire would crumble under the weight of its corruption. But the real challenge would come in the days ahead, repairing what had been broken and restoring trust to a community long betrayed. Elijah turned his face toward the sky, the rain beginning to ease. For the first time in a long time, he felt it. Hope. The courthouse lights were ablaze that night. Glowing like a beacon in the surrounding darkness, rain fell in relentless sheets, pooling into rivers that carved through the parking lot. The town of Milltown, usually silent after sunset, hummed with activity. Reporters' vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed toward the dark sky, while clusters of townspeople huddled under umbrellas. Something big was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. Inside, Elijah Moore stood in the center of the main courtroom, his heart a steady drumbeat in his chest. Rows of wooden benches stretched behind him, filled with reporters, families, and even some officers, faces watching, waiting. He'd seen these rooms before, many like it, heavy wooden doors, walls lined with portraits of old men who had rendered their judgments here for decades. Tonight, however, this room wasn't their arena. It was his. At the far end of the room, Judge Reed sat at the bench, his face pale but steely, his hands gripping the gavel like it was the only thing holding him together. Officer Daniels stood just off to the side, his arms crossed, his glare fixed on Elijah, like a hunter sizing up prey. This was it. "All rise," a clerk announced, though most people were already standing. The tension was suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Judge Reed's voice broke through the silence. "Mr. Moore, you have the floor, though I will remind you to choose your words carefully. This hearing is a courtesy. Nothing more." Elijah stepped forward, his leather folder tucked under his arm. He glanced across the room, meeting the eyes of the people who mattered most. The families who had trusted him to stand for them, Mitchell at the back of the room looking tense but resolute. And Daniels, whose smug expression made Elijah's blood simmer. "I won't waste anyone's time, Judge Reed," Elijah began, his voice steady and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. "This is no courtesy. What's happening here tonight is accountability. For years, you and Officer Daniels have operated with impunity, intimidating families, forging documents, and lining your pockets with stolen land and public funds." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reed's gavel slammed against the bench. "Order!" "Where's your proof, Moore?" Daniels barked, stepping forward. "More lies and hearsay?" Elijah turned to face him directly. "My proof is right here." He opened the folder and placed it onto the table in front of him. "Signed affidavits from victims. People your department threatened. People who were forced to sign away their homes. I have financial records showing the transfer of public funds into shell accounts controlled by Judge Reed's associates." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. and then leveled his gaze at Daniels. "And I have a sworn statement from Deputy Mitchell, confirming that you planted evidence to frame me." The room erupted, reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked, and Reed's gavel pounded furiously against the wood. Daniels' face darkened, his composure cracking like ice under pressure. "This is bull!" he shouted, jabbing a finger at Elijah. "None of that holds up." Elijah didn't flinch. "We'll let the state attorney general decide. The evidence has already been sent to them. Copies are in their hands as we speak." Daniels froze, his mouth open mid-retort. A single flicker of fear crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. Elijah pressed on, his voice sharp as a blade. "You can shout all you want, Daniels. Call me an outsider, call me a liar. It doesn't change the fact that you and Reed's house of cards is about to come crashing down." Daniels moved toward Elijah then, his fists clenched. "You son of a... Enough!" Reed's voice cracked across the room, desperate and rattled. "Sit down, Sergeant." Daniels hesitated, but obeyed, his fury palpable. Reed turned his glare on Elijah. "This circus ends now. You're making serious accusations against officers and public officials. Baseless accusations that could damage reputations." Elijah's voice cut through the judge's bluster like a scalpel. "You don't get to talk about reputations when you've spent years destroying lives for profit." Reed slammed the gavel again, his face reddening. "You will watch your tone, Mr. Moore." Elijah leaned forward, unshaken. "No, Judge Reed. You will watch yours, because for the first time in a long time, you're not the one holding the cards." The words hit like a punch, and for the first time, Reed faltered. The gavel trembled slightly in his grip as he sat back, suddenly smaller beneath the weight of Elijah's accusations. The silence that followed was heavy. For a moment, Elijah felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, some hopeful, some afraid, others uncertain. This was what men like Reed and Daniels feared most. The truth laid bare, their power stripped away, their control slipping. Daniels, unable to contain himself, leapt to his feet. "You think this changes anything?" he roared, pointing at Elijah. "You think they'll believe you? You come into our town, stirring up lies, turning people against us. You don't belong here." Elijah straightened, his voice steady but forceful. "No, Daniels, you don't belong here. Men like you, men who abuse their power and hurt the very people they're sworn to protect. You're the ones who don't belong." Daniels lunged again, but this time Mitchell stepped forward, blocking his path. "Sergeant, that's enough," he said firmly. Daniels turned on him, incredulous. "You're really siding with him? With him?" Mitchell didn't move, his expression resolute. "I'm siding with the truth." Daniels let out a bitter laugh, his chest heaving as his rage threatened to boil over. "This isn't over," he spat, his gaze drilling into Elijah. "You don't know who you're messing with." Elijah held his gaze, unflinching. "I know exactly who you are, Daniels. And the people here, they're starting to see it too." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Daniels stood trembling with fury, while Judge Reed sat silent, his expression hard but hollow. Elijah took one last look at the faces in the room, at the families who had suffered in silence for so long, at Mitchell, who had taken the first step toward standing up, and at the officers on the sidelines who watched nervously, unsure of where they stood. Elijah stepped back, gathering the folder and tucking it under his arm. "This fight isn't over," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "But one thing is clear. It's not going to end the way you want it to." He turned and walked toward the heavy courtroom doors, his steps calm, deliberate, purposeful. Behind him, Daniel's voice echoed, low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Moore." Elijah didn't stop. He didn't look back. As he pushed through the doors and into the storm outside, the cool rain struck his face like a cleansing force. He stood for a moment beneath the courthouse steps, his breath visible in the chill air. He'd made his move. The truth was out. But he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of a battle that would tear through everything Reed and Daniels had built. Elijah looked out at the reporters gathering on the steps, their cameras and microphones ready to capture his next words. Somewhere behind him, Daniels and Reed were still clinging to the remnants of their power, plotting their next move. But Elijah wasn't afraid. The storm was still raging, and he was ready. The morning after the storm, Milltown was unrecognizable. A thick silence hung over the courthouse square, where Elijah had faced down Daniels and Judge Reed the night before. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving puddles glistening in the weak morning sun, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Something the rain couldn't erase. Elijah sat in his SUV parked at the edge of the square, looking out at the town he had come to know over these long, hard days. A place that had seemed immovable, weighed down by silence and complicity, now felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. His phone buzzed in the console. He picked it up and saw Anita's name flash across the screen. "Morning," he answered, his voice calm but tired. "You did it, Elijah," Anita said without preamble, her tone buzzing with energy. "The AG's office just announced a formal investigation into Reed and Daniels' financial fraud, corruption, intimidation. It's all coming out." Elijah allowed himself a small smile, the first real one in days. "Good. It's overdue." "It's more than good. Daniels has already been suspended pending the investigation, and Reed's being removed from the bench while they review the evidence. It's crumbling faster than even I thought." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "The families? They're safe for now. Legal teams are on their way to stop the evictions and reverse the development deals. Your affidavits made all the difference." Anita paused, her voice softening. "You should be proud of yourself, Elijah. You exposed them." Elijah leaned back in his seat, the weight on his shoulders easing slightly. "It's not about me, Anita. It's about those families. I just gave them a voice." "Even so," she replied. "The world needs more people like you." Elijah didn't respond, but his thoughts lingered on those words. The world needs more people like you. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't anyone's savior. He was just a man who refused to look away when the truth demanded to be seen. By noon, the courthouse square was alive again, but the energy had changed. Reporters hovered at the building's steps, broadcasting live updates about the investigations. Clips of Elijah's press conference and his showdown with Daniels were spreading on local networks and social media. The town's secrets, long buried, were now headlines. Inside, Judge Reed's office was locked and dark, his chair empty. A notice had been posted on the door announcing his removal from duty pending the outcome of the investigation. Whispers followed his name wherever it was spoken, townspeople exchanging glances as they tried to process the fall of a man who had held so much power for so long. As for Daniels, the fallout had been swift. The news of his suspension had spread like wildfire. Officers in the department, who had once rallied around him, now distanced themselves, unwilling to go down with a sinking ship. Daniels was nowhere to be seen, but Elijah knew men like him didn't disappear quietly. There would be whispers, threats, and lingering resentment. But for now, Daniels was out of power. Elijah walked through the square, his presence impossible to ignore. People who had once eyed him with suspicion now looked at him with something closer to respect. An older man in a work jacket gave him a silent nod as he passed. A young mother holding her child paused long enough to say, "Thank you." He didn't stop to respond. He didn't need to. That afternoon, Elijah visited the families whose land had been at stake. He stood in a modest living room, the smell of fresh brewed coffee mingling with the scent of rain still clinging to the air. An elderly woman named Mrs. Harris sat in her recliner, her hands trembling slightly as she took Elijah's hand. "You don't know what this means to us," she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We thought nobody would ever listen." "They're listening now," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "And they can't ignore you anymore." Around them, other family members, neighbors, friends, gathered, their voices filled with cautious hope. For the first time in years, they were being seen. Heard. "What happens next?" someone asked. Elijah glanced around the room, meeting their eyes one by one. "It won't be easy," he admitted. "Change never is, but you're not alone anymore, and if they try to take what's yours again, you'll fight back together." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. The people here had been broken down over time, by fear, intimidation, and a system that had failed them, but today, the cracks were starting to mend. Elijah felt it too. A weight lifting, a shift that could grow into something bigger. Later that evening, Elijah found himself back at the edge of town, parked beside an open field that stretched into the horizon. The clouds had begun to part, the golden streaks of sunset bleeding through the remnants of gray. Mitchell arrived a few minutes later, his patrol car rolling up beside Elijah's SUV. He stepped out, hands shoved into his pockets, and walked over. "They're saying Daniels might cut a deal," Mitchell said quietly, staring out at the field. "Give up Reed to save himself." Elijah nodded. "Good, they'll turn on each other, it's what cowards do." Mitchell let out a dry laugh. "You're not wrong." He paused, then looked at Elijah. "I wanted to say, you were right about me. About all of us, we let it happen, and we stayed quiet." Elijah studied the younger man for a moment. "You spoke up when it counted, Mitchell. That's what matters." "Maybe." Mitchell exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You leaving soon?" "Tomorrow," Elijah replied. "There's more work to do. There's always more work to do." Mitchell turned to face him fully, his expression earnest. "What if it happens again? Someone like Daniels steps in and tries to take control." Elijah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both weariness and wisdom. "Then you'll be ready. The people here, they'll be ready, too. Change doesn't happen overnight, Mitchell. But it happens." The deputy nodded, the words settling into him. "Safe travels, Moore." Elijah gave him a firm nod in return. "Take care of this place, Mitchell. It's yours now." The next morning, as Elijah drove out of Milltown, the town looked different somehow. Brighter, lighter. Or maybe it was just the way he was looking at it now. He passed the diner where it all began, the courthouse, the streets filled with people going about their lives. People who had seen a little more truth than they'd been ready for. As the road stretched out before him, Elijah felt that familiar pull toward the next fight, the next town, the next system that needed breaking. The world didn't change on its own. Someone had to push, someone had to stand up and say enough. And if that someone was him, so be it. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it briefly. A message from Anita. "They're calling you a hero." Elijah smirked and typed back, "I'm just getting started." The road stretched on, endless and full of possibilities, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, and Elijah Moore drove toward it, ready for whatever came next.